I am sitting in my former boss's living room. His wife is in the kitchen making coffee. His name is on the mortgage. His name is on the car in the driveway. His name used to be on my paycheck. It is not on anything that matters anymore. Let me tell you how we got here. 2 years. That is how long I worked for Victor Harlow. 2 years of arriving before anyone else. 2 years of leaving after everyone had gone. 2 years of solving problems that were not technically my job, but that would have become everyone's problem if I hadn't solved them. I want to be specific about what I mean. I was hired as a senior operations analyst at Harlow Logistics. Harlow Logistics was a mid-sized supply chain management company in Atlanta. Victor had founded it 9 years earlier with 2 trucks and a warehouse lease. By the time I arrived, it had grown to 40 employees, 11 fleet vehicles, and contracts with 6 regional distribution clients worth a combined annual revenue of $4.2 million. On paper, my job was data analysis and operational reporting. I would identify inefficiencies in the logistics pipeline, present findings, and make recommendations. That was the job description. This is what actually happened. In my first week, I identified a routing inefficiency in the Southern distribution network that was costing the company approximately $11,000 a month in fuel and overtime. I did not just identify it. I built a corrected model. I presented it to Victor. He looked at the model for approximately 40 seconds. He said, "Implement it." He did not say good work. He did not say anything else. He turned back to his computer. I implemented it. The following month, the Southern network saved $14,000. Victor presented the saving at the quarterly meeting. He said, "The team has been doing excellent work optimizing our routing structures." The team. I was the team. There were 3 other analysts. None of them had touched the Southern network model. I sat at the back of the conference room and said nothing. I told myself, it's year 1. This is how you build trust. The recognition comes later. It did not come later. Here is a partial list of what I built at Harlow Logistics in 2 years. A real-time fleet tracking dashboard that reduced late deliveries by 31%. Before I built it, the company was managing routes from a spreadsheet that was manually updated twice a day. A client reporting system that automated the monthly performance summaries sent to the 6 major accounts. Before I built it, 3 analysts spent approximately 40 hours per month compiling these manually. After I built it, it took 40 minutes. A driver scheduling model that eliminated 4,000 hours of overtime in 12 months. A vendor negotiation framework that reduced the fuel procurement cost by 8% annually. A route-sharing protocol between 2 clients whose distribution networks overlapped in 3 metropolitan areas, which I negotiated directly with both client operations teams. This single initiative saved both clients money and generated a combined additional revenue for Harlow of $160,000 annually. Victor presented that last one at an industry conference. I know this because I was not invited to the conference. I found out when a colleague forwarded me the conference program, which listed Victor Harlow as the speaker for a session titled, "Collaborative Logistics Networks, a Growth Strategy." The content of that session was the framework I had built. My colleague, a driver scheduler named Jerome who had been at Harlow for 6 years and who had on multiple occasions said to me quietly and directly, "They are not giving you credit for any of this," texted me a single message after the conference. He said he presented it word for word. He said, "I watched the live stream." I said, "I know." He said, "When are you going to do something about it?" I said, "I'm working on it. I want to tell you about Jerome before I go further." Jerome Watkins had been at Harlow for 6 years when I arrived. He was 44. He had spent 12 years in the military before logistics and had the particular combination of directness and patience that comes from having operated in environments where vagueness costs people things that matter. He was not my closest friend, but he was someone I trusted. In a company where credit disappeared upward and problems rolled downward, Jerome was a fixed point. He said what he observed. He did not say it loudly, but he said it accurately. He had watched over 2 years as my work circulated through the company under other people's names. He had watched as the analysts I had trained, 3 newer hires who had been assigned to me for onboarding, began to be described in Victor's communications as a talented team. He had watched Victor's LinkedIn activity with quiet, dry commentary. He once forwarded me a post where Victor had written about building systems that scale and included a screenshot of the fleet dashboard. Jerome's message said, "No caption needed." I replied, "Noted." He replied, "Noted when?" I said, "Soon." He replied, "I'll believe it when I see it." In the summer of my 2nd year, I asked for a raise. I want to be precise about the context. I had not asked for a raise before this. I had received my original salary. I had received a 3% cost of living adjustment at the end of year one, which was the company-wide standard and which was not meaningfully connected to performance. My base salary was $62,000. I had been tracking my contribution to the company over 2 years. Conservative estimate of direct revenue impact, $620,000 annually. That is a ratio of 10 to 1. For every dollar Harlow Logistics paid me, I was generating $10 in value. I put together a document. It was 8 pages. It included a summary of every major initiative I had led, the baseline before the initiative, the outcome after, and the measurable revenue or cost impact. It included market rate data for comparable roles at comparable companies. It included a specific number. I was asking for a salary of $85,000, a 37% increase. I scheduled the meeting with Victor for a Thursday afternoon. I had not told anyone except Jerome. Jerome had said, be specific, have numbers, don't ask, present. I did exactly that. I sat across from Victor Harlow and I presented for 12 minutes. He listened. He did not look at the document. He looked at his phone twice during the presentation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. He said, 85. I said, yes. He said, that's a significant ask. I said, I've documented the basis for it. He picked up the document. He looked at the first page. He put it down. He said, you know what the problem is with people like you? I said, I don't know what you mean. He said, you track things, you count things, you put together little presentations about how valuable you are. And then you expect the company to pay for your sense of your own importance. I said nothing. He said, I pay you to do a job, you do the job. That's the arrangement. You don't get a bonus for doing what you were hired to do. I said, the document shows initiatives well outside my original job description that generated, he said, everything in this company is outside someone's job description. That's how small companies work. Everyone goes above and beyond, you're not special, he smiled. It was not a kind smile. He said, 85, that's funny. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do. You'll get 4% at the year-end review, same as everyone else. And you can take that, or you can see what else the market has for a spreadsheet analyst in Atlanta. He said the word spreadsheet analyst the way someone says a word they find slightly contemptible. I said, I appreciate your time. I stood up. I walked out. I did not say anything else. In the corridor outside his office, I stood for a moment and breathed. Then I walked to the bathroom. I ran cold water over my hands. I looked at myself in the mirror. I thought, okay, I texted Jerome one word. I said soon. He replied in 30 seconds. He said, how soon? I said, very. He said, good. I want to tell you about Rachel Harlow, Victor's wife. I had met her 3 times before the day everything changed. The company Christmas party year 1. A client dinner where spouses were invited. A charity event Victor had attended for visibility. She was 41 years old. She had a background in architecture before she stopped working to manage the household and their 2 children's schedules. She was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are used to being in rooms where their quietness is taken for granted rather than noticed. She was sharp. I noticed the quietness, but I also noticed what lived underneath it. At the Christmas party, she had asked me more substantive questions about my work in 10 minutes than Victor had asked in 12 months. She had said, what do you actually find interesting about logistics? No one had ever asked me that. I had said, the patterns. The way everything is supposed to be chaotic but isn't if you look at the data correctly. It's like the whole thing wants to be efficient. You just have to show it how. She had nodded the way people nod when they have actually heard you. She had said, Victor describes it as moving things from one place to another. I had said, that's one way to look at it. She had smiled. It was a slightly tired smile. The smile of someone who has been listening to reductive descriptions for a long time. I had not thought much about Rachel after that evening, until I saw something I was not supposed to see. It was a Tuesday in October, 8 weeks after the Ray's conversation. I was working late, as I always worked late, which I now understood to be entirely for my own benefit and no one else's. The office had emptied. I was in the server room running a backup protocol. The server room shared a wall with Victor's private office. The wall was thin. I was not listening, but voices carry in empty buildings. I heard Victor's voice. Then a woman's voice that was not his wife's, then silence of a specific kind. I stood very still. I was not processing it immediately. What I was processing was the name I had heard. Lisa Connors, Victor's executive assistant, 28 years old, hired 11 months ago. I thought about the 3% cost of living adjustment. I thought about spreadsheet analyst. I thought about that's funny. I thought about Rachel at the Christmas party asking me what I found interesting about my work. I stood in the server room until the voices began again, normal voices now, conversation, the sound of someone gathering belongings. Then I walked very quietly to my desk. I collected my things. I left. In my car, I sat for a long time. I was not angry. I was not planning anything. I was just sitting with the weight of knowing something. And slowly, the way a shape becomes visible when the light changes, I began to understand how all the pieces fit together. The day after the Ray's conversation, I had opened my personal laptop at home and quietly begun doing something I should have done 6 months earlier. I had begun talking to other companies. Not urgently, not desperately, methodically. I sent 4 carefully written inquiries to competitors and adjacent companies in the supply chain space. I heard back from 3. The most interesting response came from a company called Meridian Supply Partners. They were based in Atlanta. They were growing. They were, by every metric I could find, 3 years behind where Harlow Logistics was operationally, which meant they needed exactly what I had spent 2 years building. I had 3 conversations with their VP of operations over 6 weeks. By the end of those conversations, they had offered me a role, Director of Operations. Salary, $112,000. Equity participation beginning year 2, full operational mandate, a team I would build. I accepted on a Thursday morning. I gave Harlow Logistics 2 weeks' notice effective the following Monday. But before I submitted that letter, before I walked into Victor's office with the envelope, I did one thing. I called Rachel. I want to be careful about how I describe this. I did not call Rachel to damage Victor. I did not call Rachel because I wanted anything from her. I called Rachel because she was a person who deserved to know something that her life was being built around without her knowledge. That is the only reason. I had her number from a contact sheet distributed at a company family event. I had never used it before. She answered on the 3rd ring. She said, "Hello." I said, "Rachel, this is Nathan. I've worked for Victor." She said, "Nathan, yes, I remember you." The Christmas party. I said, "Yes, I'm sorry to call like this, but there's something I need to tell you and I think you deserve to hear it directly rather than find out another way." There was a pause. She said, "Okay." Her voice had changed, not panicked. Just prepared, in the way that people prepare when they have been half expecting a phone call like this and are relieved and devastated in equal measure that it has finally come. I told her what I had heard, not graphically, not with commentary, just the facts, the date. The time, the names. I told her it had not been the first time based on the comfort level of what I had observed. I told her that I thought she should know. Then I said, "I'm submitting my resignation today. I just wanted to tell you before I left." I didn't think it was right to leave without telling you. There was a long silence. Then she said very quietly, "How long have you known?" I said, 8 weeks. She said, "Why did you wait?" I said, "I was making sure I had somewhere to go first. I didn't want to tell you and then still be dependent on him." Another silence. She said, "That's a very considered thing to do." I said, "I'm sorry, this is the reason I'm calling." She said, "Don't be, I think I've known for a while. I just needed someone to say it out loud." She said, "Thank you, Nathan." She hung up. I sat in my car in the Harlow Logistics parking lot. I had the resignation letter on the passenger seat. I went inside. I submitted it. Victor read it. He looked up. He said Meridian. He had seen the letterhead of their offer letter on my desk 3 weeks earlier. I had left it there deliberately. He said, "They'll run you into the ground." I said, "I appreciate the opportunity you gave me here." I turned and walked out. Jerome was at his desk. I stopped in front of him. I said, "I'm leaving Monday." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "It's about time." He stood up and shook my hand. He said, "Wherever you're going, they're getting more than they know." I said, "Take care of yourself, Jerome." He said, "I'll watch what happens here with great interest." He was not wrong about what happened here. Let me tell you about the 2 weeks between my resignation and my last day. They were illuminating. On day 3 after my resignation, a client called the main office asking for me directly. The receptionist transferred them to James Park, one of the junior analysts. James had been trained by me, had used systems I built, and had, to his credit, absorbed a significant amount of operational knowledge in the 18 months we had worked together. He was not me. The client, Tom Brecker, operations director at Southeastern Freight Solutions, one of the 6 major accounts, called me on my personal cell that evening. He said, "Nathan, I heard you're leaving." I said, "Yes, my last day is Friday." He said, "Who's my contact going to be?" I said, "James Park will be taking over your account." There was a pause. He said, "James is a good analyst, but he doesn't know our account the way you know it." I said, "He'll get up to speed quickly." He said, "Nathan, I'm going to be direct with you." "Where are you going?" I said, "Meridian Supply Partners." He said, "Are you allowed to take client relationships with you?" I said, "I'm not going to encourage any client to follow me, Tom. That's not why I'm telling you." He said, "I understand. But hypothetically, if Meridian were able to service our account at a comparable level, would that be something you'd be open to discussing?" I said, "Give me 90 days to get the operation running properly. Then let's have that conversation." He said, 90 days, done. He called Meridian 93 days later. Southeastern Freight Solutions became Meridian's largest account. But that came later. What happened in those 2 weeks at Harlow, before I even left, was the first visible crack in the structure. Because the moment it became known I was leaving, the people who had been relying on the systems I had built, without fully understanding those systems, began to feel what underneath the hood of the operation actually looked like. The fleet dashboard began generating errors on day 5 after my notice, not because it was badly built. Because the data feed that populated it required a weekly reconciliation that I had been doing manually, and that I had documented, but that no one had been trained on because the documentation had never been formally assigned to anyone. James spent 3 days trying to fix it before asking me. I walked him through the reconciliation in 40 minutes. He said, "Why wasn't this in the handover documents?" I said, "It is in the handover documents. Page 12, he looked. He said, "I only read to page 8. I said nothing. The client reporting system stopped generating the automated monthly summaries for 2 of the 6 major accounts. This was because those 2 clients had migrated to a new internal system in the previous quarter and the data connection required updating. Again, documented. Page 17. Victor called me into his office on day 9. He said, "There are issues." I said, "I'm aware. I've been helping where I can." He said, "Can you extend your notice period?" He said it the way a person says something they know they should not have to say. I looked at him. I thought about spreadsheet analyst. I thought about that's funny. I said, "I have commitments at my new role that begin Monday." I said, "I'm happy to be available for paid consulting at a day rate of $2,200 if specific issues require my involvement after Friday." He stared at me. I had never charged him for my time before. I had given it freely, willingly, in the belief that the investment would be recognized. He now understood what that time had actually been worth. He said nothing. I said, "Let me know if that's useful." I left his office. Jerome texted me that evening. He said, "The look on his face when you left the room." He said, "I would have paid money for that. My last day was a Friday. I cleaned out my desk. I said goodbye to the people worth saying goodbye to." Jerome walked me to the parking lot. He said, "When things get bad enough here, and they will get bad enough, I'm going to call you." I said, "I hope things don't get that bad." He said, "I hope so too. But I've worked here for 6 years and I know what holds this place together." He looked at me. He said, "It was you." I got in my car. I started over. Meridian was different from the first day, not because it was easier. It was harder in many ways, a smaller operation, less infrastructure, a team that had been running on instinct and goodwill rather than systems. But the difference was this: when I walked into the office at Meridian, the CEO, a woman named Patricia Coles, who had founded the company 8 years earlier, and who reminded me in her directness and her attention of everything Victor had failed to be, looked at the operational assessment I had prepared in my first week. She read all of it. She said, "How long did this take you?" I said, 4 evenings. She said, "Nathan, this is what I hired you for. This is exactly this." She said, "Do you know how long I've been waiting for someone to show me this picture clearly?" I said, "Now I can show you what to do with it." She said, "Yes, do that." I did that. I want to tell you what happened at Harlow Logistics while I was doing that. Jerome texted me updates periodically, not gossip, just facts. Month 1, the Eastern Routing Network began generating delayed deliveries. The driver scheduling model had not been maintained properly. 2 of the major clients formally flagged performance issues. Month 2, Tom Brecker called Victor and requested a meeting about the account. Victor sent James. Tom called me afterward. He said the meeting had lasted 11 minutes before he ended it. Month 3, Harlow Logistics lost the Southeastern Freight Solutions contract. It was worth $410,000 annually. It was their second largest account. The day after it was announced internally, Jerome texted me 3 words. He said, "Here it comes." Month 4, a second major account flagged non-performance. Month 5, Victor made 3 new hires to replace capacity that had been lost. 2 of the hires had technical backgrounds. Neither of them had built anything from scratch. Both of them could maintain systems they understood. They did not understand the systems I had built, because the systems I had built had been designed around a specific operational logic that lived primarily in my head and secondarily in documentation that was thorough, but that required someone who understood the underlying thinking to properly apply. Jerome called me in month 5. He said, "It's bad." I said, "How bad?" He said, "Victor had a meeting with the board last week. The revenue numbers are down 22% from the same period last year." He said he blamed market conditions. He paused. He said, "Nathan, the market conditions are fine." I looked at the competitor numbers. I said, "I know." He said he is also not coping well personally. I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Rachel left." He said it quietly, the way you say something that is significant but not surprising. I said when. He said about 6 weeks ago, she took the children. He said the word in the office is that there was a conversation with someone, that Victor found out, that things accelerated. I said nothing. He said, was that you? I said, Jerome. He said, I'm not asking to judge. I'm asking because I've been watching you for 2 years and you don't do things without a reason. I said she deserved to know. There was a pause. He said, yes, she did. He said, Victor knows or suspects. He hasn't said anything directly, but I've heard his voice through his office door a few times in the last month, not the way people sound when they're talking about business. He said he sounds like a man who has lost everything and is only beginning to understand how. I said, Jerome, are you okay over there? He said, I've updated my resume. I said, send it to me. He said, what for? You work at a competitor. I said, send it to me anyway. He sent it that afternoon. I forwarded it to Patricia. She called Jerome the following week. He started at Meridian 6 weeks later. Let me tell you about Rachel. After that phone call in the Harlow parking lot, the one where I told her what I had heard, I did not contact her again. I gave her the information she needed. I left. I did not know what she would do with it. I did not know if she would act on it at all. People sometimes receive information like that and do nothing. The disruption of the known, even a known that is wrong, is sometimes more manageable than the disruption of the unknown. Rachel was not that kind of person. She called her attorney the week after we spoke. She retained a divorce attorney by the end of that week. She had her own finances independently evaluated. She did what she did with the precision and calmness of someone who had already been doing the internal work for a long time and had simply been waiting for the external confirmation to allow herself to act. She called me on a Sunday afternoon 3 months after I had left Harlow. She said, I hope this is not an intrusive call. I said, it isn't. She said, I wanted to tell you the divorce was filed. I said, I heard. I'm sorry. She said, don't be. I've been more myself in the last 3 months than I have been in 4 years. She said, I also want to thank you. I said, you don't need to thank me. She said, I know I don't need to. I want to. She said, can I ask you something? I said, yes. She said, when you called me that day in the parking lot, you said you had waited until you had somewhere to go, until you weren't dependent on him anymore. I said, yes. She said, why did that matter to you? I thought about it. I said, because I didn't want my reason for telling you to be tangled up with my own situation. I wanted it to be clean. She said, it was. She said, that's not a small thing, Nathan. There was a pause. She said, I'd like to have coffee sometime. If that's something you'd be open to, I said, I'd like that. We had coffee. And then we had dinner. And then there were evenings on the phone that lasted past midnight, the way evenings do when you have found someone who asks good questions and listens to the answers. I want to be careful here. What happened between Rachel and me was not a strategy. It was not planned. It was not part of any sequence of events I had designed from a parking lot in October. It was two people who, in the aftermath of things that had cost them both something real, found themselves interested in each other. That is what it was. What it became slowly over several months without urgency and without performance was something more. I will tell you the rest of what happened at Harlow Logistics because it is relevant. And because Jerome, who watched it unfold from the inside until he no longer had to, told me about it. In month 7, the board of Harlow Logistics convened a formal performance review. Victor was asked to present the recovery plan. He presented a document that Jerome described to me as thin. Revenue was down 29% from the prior year. 3 of the 6 major accounts had left or significantly reduced their contracts. The operational infrastructure, the dashboard, the scheduling system, the reporting tools had degraded to a point where the company had reverted to manual processes for several key functions. The board asked Victor who had built those tools. He said the operations team. The board asked who specifically. Jerome, who was now at Meridian and who had provided a brief written account to the board in response to a formal inquiry. The board had reached out after a former client mentioned my name, had said specifically. The board had my name. They had the documentation. They had the 8-page presentation I had given Victor on the Thursday afternoon in the summer of my 2nd year, the one he had put down after looking at the first page. Victor was placed on a formal performance improvement plan. The PIP ran for 60 days. At the end of 60 days, the revenue numbers had not improved. 3 more employees had left, including 2 of the newer technical hires who had been unable to rebuild what I had built. The board voted to replace Victor as CEO. He was removed from operational leadership effective immediately. He retained an equity stake but no role. His name was still on the building. It was not on anything that mattered anymore. Jerome texted me the day after the vote. He sent 3 words. He said, it is done. He said, how is life? I said, good. How is Meridian? He said, better every week. He said, Jerome Watkins, Senior Fleet Operations Manager. He said, I like the sound of that. I said, you earned it. He said, we both did. I want to tell you something about the house. The house that Victor and Rachel had bought together. It was a large craftsman-style home in a neighborhood north of Atlanta, 4 bedrooms, a backyard with a deck. A study that Rachel had originally designed for herself as a home workspace before the children arrived, and the workspace became a playroom, and her professional ambitions became the thing that would be returned to eventually. Rachel kept the house in the divorce settlement. Victor had the equity stake in a company that was, at the time of the settlement, generating significantly reduced revenue. The house was a more reliable asset. Rachel kept it. She renovated the study. She returned to architecture part-time, working with a small residential firm that allowed her the flexibility she needed. She put bookshelves back in the study. She put a drafting table in the corner. She made the room hers. I moved in on a Saturday in February, not because of strategy. Not because of planning. Because Rachel asked me to. Because after 7 months of conversations and dinners and evenings that lasted past midnight, the question of where I was living had become, in the most natural way, a practical question rather than a conceptual one. She said, "You're here most of the time anyway." I said, "Yes." She said, "The children like you." I said, "I like them." She said, "The guest room is becoming an odd fiction." I said, "Yes." She said, "Nathan." I said, "Yes." She said, "Stay." I said, "Okay." I sit in this house on Saturday mornings with coffee and the operations reports from Meridian and a view of the backyard where the children play. I am 34 years old. I am director of operations at a company that grew 24% in my first year. I am in a house that is warm and well-lit and full of the specific peace that comes when you stop performing for someone who will never see you clearly and start simply being seen. Victor Harlow retained his equity stake. It has not generated a distribution in 8 months. He lives in an apartment in Midtown. He still goes to the industry conference each year. I do not know if he still presents other people's work. I do not attend that conference. I have my own work now. I want to tell you one thing about Jerome before I finish. He came to dinner at the house last month. He had met Rachel before briefly. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Rachel and I have had every conversation that has mattered in the last year, and he looked around the room. He said, "Nathan." I said, "Yes." He said, "You know, when I texted you after that Ray's meeting and said soon, what did you mean by that?" I said, "I meant I was done waiting for him to be fair." He said, "And this," he gestured at the room, at the house, at the general shape of things, "this was not what you meant." I said, "No, this was not what I meant." I said, "I meant I was going to find a better job and leave quietly." He said, "And instead," I said, "instead I told the truth to someone who deserved to hear it, and everything else followed from that." Jerome looked at me for a long time. He said, "My mother used to say that the truth doesn't give you what you plan for. It gives you what you need." He said, "I think she was right." I said, "I think she was too." Rachel came in from the garden. She put her hand briefly on my shoulder as she passed. Jerome noticed. He said nothing. He smiled into his coffee. The kind of smile that doesn't need to be explained. Victor spent 2 years looking at my work and seeing a cost. He never saw what it was worth. He spent 2 years in a house with a woman who was paying attention to the wrong things, or rather, to the right things that had stopped being returned to her. He sent me 23 words on a Thursday afternoon. He said, "You can take that or you can see what else the market has." I took the other option. Everything followed from that, not because I planned it. Because the truth, when you stop carrying it for the wrong person, tends to find the person it belongs to. And it does not travel alone. Some promises were never meant to be kept. Some jobs were never meant to be permanent. Some houses are built for the wrong person until the right one arrives. If this felt familiar, you already know where to find the next one. I want to go back to that Thursday afternoon, the Ray's meeting, because there is something I have not told you about what happened after I left his office. I walked down the corridor. I passed Lisa's desk. She looked up. She said, "How did it go?" She said it pleasantly, the way someone says something when they already know the answer. I looked at her for a moment. She had been at Harlow for 11 months. She had been hired through a recruiter Victor had used. She had a background in executive administration and was competent at the logistical elements of the role. She smiled at me. I said, "It went fine." I walked to the bathroom. I stood at the sink. I thought about what I knew. I knew what I had heard in the server room 3 weeks earlier. I knew what the smile at the desk meant. I knew what 11 months of a woman being described as Victor's most reliable team member while simultaneously being unreachable between 6 and 8 on Tuesday evenings meant. I had not been looking for any of it. It had simply been visible once I started paying the right kind of attention. The kind of attention Victor had never paid to anything that didn't directly benefit him. I dried my hands. I went back to my desk. I opened my personal laptop. I found the email from Meridian's VP of Operations. I replied. I said, "I'm ready to move forward. 8 weeks later, I sat in my car in the parking lot. I had the resignation letter. I had already called Rachel. And I had made a decision that I want to be honest about. I had made the decision to tell Rachel not because it would help me, not because Victor deserved it, not even entirely because Rachel deserved to know, though she did. I told Rachel because I am the kind of person who believes that the people closest to a truth should not be the last ones to see it. Because I had watched, for 2 years, a man take credit for other people's work. Take credit for the systems I built. Take credit for the clients I brought in. Present my frameworks at conferences. Describe my team's contributions as his vision. And I had been silent, not because silence was right, because I had not been ready. The moment I was ready, the moment I had somewhere to go, something of my own, a foundation that was not dependent on his, I stopped being silent. About everything. I think about that sometimes. The specific cost of waiting. Jerome said to me early in my second year, "Why don't you say something? Why don't you put your name on it?" I had said, "The time isn't right," he had said. "When is the time right?" I had said, "When I have somewhere to land." He had been frustrated with that answer. Looking back, I think he was right to be frustrated, because the longer you wait to name a thing, the more it costs you, not just professionally, something more subtle. The longer you perform contentment you don't feel, the more it costs you access to the version of yourself that knows what it actually wants. I had spent 2 years being useful to a man who would never value that usefulness. I had told myself it was strategic. It was also, in part, easier than confronting what I already knew. I know that now. There is something I want to say about Meridian, about Patricia Coles specifically, because she is part of this story in a way I have not fully acknowledged. Patricia hired me on the basis of a 40-minute conversation and an operational assessment I had prepared without being asked. In the first week, she walked me through the company, every department, every team, every function. She introduced me to each person by name. She said, "This is Nathan. He's here to build systems. If you have a problem you haven't been able to solve, he wants to hear it." She said it without irony, she meant it. On the Friday of that first week, she came to my office at the end of the day. She said, "How are you finding it?" I said, "Good, I have a lot of questions." She said, "That's correct, you should have a lot of questions." She said, "Nathan, one thing I want you to know about how we operate here." I said, "Okay." She said, "When something goes right in this company, I say who made it go right. Out loud, in the room, in front of the people who matter." She said, "I am not interested in vague attribution. I am not interested in team wins that erase individual contributions. If you build something, I will say you built it." She said, "That is the deal here." I looked at her. I said, "That's a good deal." She said, "Yes, it is. Good night." She left. I sat at my desk for a moment. I thought about Victor in his office. I thought about that's funny. I thought about how much of the last 2 years I had spent building things for a man who could not bring himself to say a name. Then I opened my laptop. I started working. Month 9 at Meridian. Patricia called me into her office. She had the quarterly numbers on her screen. She turned the screen toward me. Revenue up 31% year over year. On-time delivery rate 94%, the highest in the company's history. 3 new major accounts signed. Tom Brecker's Southeastern Freight Solutions contributing $260,000 annually. Patricia said, "Nathan?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to talk about your compensation." I said, "Okay." She said, "The package we offered you at hire was correct for what we knew at the time. It is not correct for what we know now." She pushed a sheet across the desk. New salary $148,000, equity acceleration, performance bonus structure. I looked at the sheet. I thought about 8 pages. I thought about 40 seconds of a man glancing at a document before deciding it wasn't worth reading. I looked at Patricia. She said, "Is this acceptable?" I said, "Yes, thank you." She said, "Don't thank me, you earned it. I'm just doing the math." She said it plainly. No ceremony, no performance, just the math. I have thought many times about what makes one person able to say that sentence and another person unable to. I have not reached a complete answer. What I believe is that certain people are afraid of other people's value. They confuse acknowledging it with diminishing themselves, as if the size of someone else's contribution reduces the size of their own. Victor was afraid of my value. He could see it, he used it, he presented it, he built a company on it, but he could not name it, because naming it would have required him to hold 2 things at once: his own contribution and mine. And he only had room for one of them in the story he told about himself. Patricia Coles had room for everyone. That is, I think, the whole difference. I want to tell you about the day I drove past the Harlow Logistics building. It was a Saturday morning. I was not going there. I was on my way to a client meeting. Tom had asked me to come in for a planning session on a Saturday because that was when his team was available. The route took me past the building. I had driven past it dozens of times over the previous year without thinking much about it. But that Saturday morning, for the first time, there was a sign in the parking lot. A real estate sign, commercial lease available. They had moved, downsized. Or closed entirely. I did not know which, and I did not look it up. I drove past. I did not stop. I thought about the server room, the thin wall, the voices I had not been trying to hear. I thought about standing at the bathroom sink running cold water over my hands. I thought about a resignation letter on a passenger seat. I thought about Rachel saying stay. And I thought, it is a very strange thing what a single decision can become, not a plan. Not a strategy, not a sequence of moves. A single decision to tell the truth to someone who deserved it, and everything that followed from that. I drove to Tom's office. I walked in, I shook his hand, I sat down, I said, let's talk about the next year. He said, we built something. That is the whole story. You work for a person who cannot see you. You wait until you are ready. You find somewhere to land. You tell the truth to the people who deserve it. And then you step off the ledge you have been standing on. The falling feels like falling for a very short time. And then it feels like flying. Some promises were never meant to be kept. Some jobs, some houses. Some versions of the story you've been telling yourself about patience and timing and waiting for someone to finally give you credit. You already know which ones are hollow. You already know. The question is when you decide you've waited long enough. I decided on a Thursday afternoon at $62,000 a year when a man looked at 8 pages of my work and said, that's funny. I have not stopped finding things funny since. If this felt like you already know where to find the next one. I want to tell you one more thing about Lisa, because she exists in this story and she deserves to be seen clearly. She was 28 years old. She had taken a job she was good at. She had made choices that affected people she may not have fully considered. She was not the villain of this story. Victor was not entirely the villain either. Villains are clean. Villains have motives and plans and coherent intentions. What Victor had was something messier. He had a deep need to be the largest person in every room. That need made him take what others built and call it his own. It made him dismiss people who threatened the story he told about himself. It made him seek reassurance from someone young and new and uncomplicated by the truth of what he actually was. That is not villainy. It is a particular kind of smallness that becomes destructive at scale. I do not hate Victor. I do not think about Victor much anymore. What I think about, on Saturday mornings with coffee and the operations reports and the sound of children in the backyard, is this. The world sorts itself out, not always, not quickly, not without cost to people who deserved better, but in the direction of truth, slowly and without announcing itself, like a fleet routing system finding the most efficient path, not because someone is managing it. Because that is what efficiency does when the constraints are honest. Victor had a company built on dishonest constraints. He pretended the value was his. He pretended the relationships were the company's. He pretended the person at the desk was replaceable. The moment the constraints became honest, the moment I left and took what was actually mine, the system found a different path. One that did not run through him. I did not design that. I just stopped pretending I was a piece of his machine. That was enough. That is always enough. You stop pretending, everything else follows. Some promises were never meant to be kept. The job that took everything and gave back a title. The marriage built on a foundation that was already hollow. The office where your name was everyone's but your own. They hold until they don't. And when they don't, when the weight finally overcomes the pretending, the people who built things on honest foundations are still standing. Every time, if this felt like something you've lived, you already know where the next one is.